Are you on anything right now?
Well, of course I'm on a drug. It's called Charlie Sheen. Carlos Estevez. Carlos Sheen. Charlie Estevez. Janet Estevez. Ramon Sheen. Billy O'Sheen. Mama Dad Me. Billy Renee Me. Carlos B. Sheen. Sheen Me Ma.
All these radio rants have people thinking Charlie Sheen has got to be on drugs.
Wow. Electric bouillabaisse right from Jump Street. So basically, your question, all these fladio plants, clav gleepel bluing, glet gleim flum blugs. When's the last time your radio rants led to this?
Have you had any?
No. Whoa. Before you ask the next question, why don't you get high on this drug? Ding! Pretty cool beans. How about we trade our tiger blood for some winning? Ding! Pretty fucking cool, huh?
Hi, this is Jerry Kroth. I'm a psych professor at Santa Clara University in California, and I've made two propaganda lectures so far. One is called The Media Matrix, How Propaganda and Mass Media Are Altering Our Contact with Reality, and the other was called Propaganda and Manipulation. Now, these were basically academic lectures, and they're not TED Talks. You know, they were a bit longer. And 150,000 people have watched them and have asked for another one. So I thought I would do a third lecture on propaganda for my folks on YouTube and iTunes University. So this one is called Propaganda 3, Psychodramas and Blind Spots. So let's talk first about psychodramas. These are collective news fantasies that have crossed American television screens, the news broadcasts, in the last 20 years. They're the story of Jon Benet Ramsey, Amanda Knox, Elizabeth Smart, Casey Anthony. And they got considerable amount of attention. Let's take a look at each one just a little bit. Jon Benet Ramsey was a 6-year-old girl whose mother dressed her up to look like a fashion model. And she was raped and murdered in the basement of her house. 300 cameras and camera crews descended on the Ramsey household, and they were not there to express their condolences. They were there to basically indict the Ramseys because they thought, why, my God, what kind of parents would dress their child up and sexualize their child to such an extent? And some wide-eyed detectives in the Boulder, Colorado Police Department kind of fueled that media frenzy.
I know who killed Jon Benet. There's no doubt in my mind who killed Jon Benet. And while this investigation is still ongoing, I don't think it's appropriate that I say that name out loud.
Linda Arndt was the first detective on the scene at the Ramsey house on December 20.
So you can see that the Ramseys are being tried in the press and in the media.
Investigators and the media immediately focused on her parents, Jon and Patsy Ramsey.
To those of you who may want to ask, let me address very directly, I did not kill my daughter, Jon Benet.
Critics of the investigation pointed to mistakes made.
So the tabloid press had a heyday. The Ramseys they had to move. Both of the Ramseys had so much pressure on them. They both at one time considered suicide. They were obviously presumed guilty in the press. And the truth of the story is it's been going on now for well over 12, 15 years. They never caught the murderer. But what's the truth? Well, Mrs. Ramsey was a beauty queen. She since passed away from ovarian cancer. But little young mothers often have their babies, and they take pictures of their babies and enter pictures in the baby photo contests. And since she was a beauty queen, she entered her daughter in what is called pageantry. It's beauty queens for little girls, and there's nothing sexual about it. The press, of course, said Jon Benet Ramsey was a pedophile's dream. Be that as it may, it was a relatively innocent activity of a mother with a 6-year-old child. The Boulder police said 12 years later they had found new DNA evidence, and the scientific evidence convinces us to state that your immediate family, including you, your wife Patsy, and your son Burke, were not under any suspicion in the commission of this crime. To the extent that we may have contributed in any way to the public perception that you might have been involved in the crime, I am deeply sorry. Boulder District Attorney. So, despite all of that media frenzy, there was a Gallup poll taken of how much people had heard about the Ramsey case. This case had actually saturated the American media. 90% of the American population had heard of it. Only 10% of the American population had no opinion. And close to 30% of the American people believe that both Mrs. Ramsey and Mr. Ramsey raped and murdered their own daughter. Okay. The next case of a media obsession that occurred in America News is the case of Amanda Knox, who was a college girl, went to Italy, got involved in a sexual tryst, a menage a trois, so said the Italian police. Things got hot and heavy, and her roommate was killed. And she was accused as a co-conspirator in that sex thrill-killing murder. She was indicted, she was found guilty, she was let out, she was appealing, she was re-indicted, and the story went on and on and on, and the media enjoyed every moment of it. Not Barbara Walters, but Diane Sawyer interviewed Amanda and asked about the menage a trois. And 22 million people watched Diane's mysterious piece of journalism. Is that journalism? Okay, so here's a little excerpt on
They've
that.
actually retried the case. They've retried all the evidence. They've retested. They've had these DNA experts come in and now undermine much of the DNA testimony. So you don't need a new trial. If this appellate court comes in and says this, they're done.
Call it undermine. You may call it undermining the DNA evidence, Dan, but come on, they said the DNA may have been rye bread. I'm not buying that. That doesn't mean she's not going to walk next week. But come on, Dan, her dream sequence, she was awake. She had a daymare that she was in the apartment when the girl, Meredith Kircher, died and heard her screaming and did nothing. A daymare, a vision?
Then why do you
think
think
she told police?
Then why do you think she'll be released then? Do you think there's a good chance?
So, in the days of Walter Cronkite, they used the term alleged suspect. Remember that? Now we seem to indict people in the media all the time. So Elizabeth Smart's story comes next. She's an innocent girl in Utah, and is plucked from her innocence at the age of 14 by a former handyman who effectively rapes her every single day for the next 9 months, with the complicity of his wife. Here's a little bit on that story.
Who had reportedly been forced to live for months as Mitchell's young wife is reunited with her elated family, and Mitchell and his alleged partner in kidnapping crime, Wanda Eileen Barzee, are behind.
Now, an African-American journalist said, how come all these stories that get on primetime news are stories of white girls? 65% of all abducted children are black. So why isn't the story of the 11-year-old boy in Chicago who was abducted, why doesn't that make ABC? Why doesn't Diane Sawyer interview those parents and find out about how they feel? Well, I think the answer is, and you can probably guess, that the executive producers would say, excuse me, I'm not in the business of bringing you reality. I'm in the business of finding eyeballs, developing market share, having an audience, hypnotizing my audience, making them want to buy a Toyota or what other drugs and paraphernalia we happen to be selling on that. We're here as a profit center in the media, and we need stories that attract, hypnotize, titillate. So that's why they are what they are. Now, Elizabeth Smart had a lot of PTSD. She was still a teenager, but the media still wanted to know everything about it, particularly Nancy Grace. She came on television after she was released. Those two, by the way, were given 430 years in prison. But Elizabeth Smart wanted to represent a bill for a senator on abducted children. She did not want to talk about her experiences. That is not what Nancy Grace wanted.
Kidnappers tell you they would hurt you or your family if you tried to get away?
They did. And I really am here to support the bill and not to go into what happened to me, what is in my past, because I'm not here to give an interview on that. I'm here to help push this bill through.
And I want you to push the bill through, and I want people to hear your voice. When we take a look back, there is a shot of Elizabeth Smart, and here she is 4 years later, and frankly, it's a miracle that she was ever found. A lot of people have seen shots of you wearing a burqa. How did you see out of that thing?
I'm really not going to talk about this at this time. I mean, that's something I just don't even look back at, and I really, to be frankly honest, I really don't appreciate you bringing all this up.
I'm sorry, dear. I thought that you would...
Well, on we go to our next collective fantasy, which is the case of Casey Anthony, which involved a mother who was accused.
There's been so much media scrutiny of this case for the last 3 years, and probably no one in the media covered it with as much passion or as much controversy as Nancy Grace of HLN. She's with us right now. We're going to go to her in just a second. But first, here's a look back at some of Grace's coverage of the defendant she called Tot Mom.
Tot Mom Casey Anthony on trial for the murder of her 2-year-old little girl, Kelly.
Tot Mom now going after her brother and father relentlessly.
For 31 days, she didn't report her daughter missing.
Today, a complete shift in Tot Mom's appearance and demeanor in court, laughing, smiling, joking.
You're not going to get a fair verdict every single time you go to a jury. Somewhere out there, the devil is dancing tonight.
And Nancy Grace is right here.
So George Stephanopoulos asked her, well, she was found not guilty after all of your parade of indictments. Are you guilty of media assassination? He asked her, and she said, no, George, I'm just in pursuit of the truth. Well, Jon Stewart did a very funny expose of Nancy Grace as she was on her way to another sex
including
story.
Another good crime drama, the kidnappings in Cleveland, from their current locations. Ashley Banfield from a parking lot in Phoenix reporting via satellite with Nancy Grace, who seemed to be in the same parking lot in Phoenix. I'm basing that, of course, on the fact that the cars that are passing by Ashley Banfield's location box also appear to be passing directly into Nancy Grace's box.
So, these stories have something in common. Okay, they are about incest, murder, pedophilia, sex slaves, kidnapping, menage a trois, child murder, and murder. They're the stuff of soap operas in the afternoon. They are the stuff of B novels. But now they are the stuff of the news. And they have penetrated the news in a way that you will be surprised to see the degree of saturation these kinds of stories have. So, as a social scientist, I wanted to make a comparison. We have 4 collective news fantasies, psychodramas. Let's take a look at 4 historic stories in the media. Okay, let's take a look first at things that affect human beings and that are not titillating. They don't have a sexual subtext, but they are relevant to the status of the human race and on this planet. If you remember the story of Fukushima, 2011, nuclear reactors destroyed in a tsunami. According to Dr. Janet Sherman, the site today 2016, is so radioactive and unstable, it may never be contained. There are areas of these reactors that they have not even invented appropriate instruments to go and measure what's going on there because it's so highly radioactive. The amount of radiation from Fukushima that has now reached North America is probably nearly as much as was spread over Japan during the initial disaster. Cesium has been detected on the shores of California. So it is still a very, very big and important story. Let's go to our next factual, historic story, the Higgs boson. Professor Higgs in 1960 suggested there was a particle that would explain how mass was created. It would have completed the standard model of physics, which some people call the most important scientific theory in the history of the human race. Higgs boson nailed that theory to the wall. Okay? It was considered by one physicist the greatest discovery of all time in physics. He won the Nobel Prize for it. Okay, it got some coverage in the news, clearly important for the human race. The Indonesian tsunami in 2004 killed over 200,000 people in 9 different countries. It was a major natural disaster.
We were trapped on a roof and we were helpless. Shit.
When the second wave came, I saw an older couple have difficulties getting their way through the water. They needed help. So I tried to reach them, and when I was like 2 meters from them, they fell down and disappeared.
The next story I want to take you to is the British Petroleum Deepwater Horizon spill in the Gulf of Mexico. Between 90 and 180 million gallons of oil spewed into the Gulf of Mexico. George Bush had allowed this company to do an experimental kind of drilling. They went down a mile to the seafloor, and then they drilled 6 miles further to find deep oil. And they didn't, unfortunately, have the technology to deal with the spill. If it started to erupt and they couldn't get down a mile to stop it, how long would that oil well gush forth? Well, that was a question that occupied a lot of minds for a couple months. It was the biggest oil spill in the history of the petroleum industry, and it certainly affected a lot of lives and the water. Finally, they capped it, but there was a great deal of destruction, and it was thought to be a lot worse than it seems to this day that it actually was. This is a satellite photo of just how extensive that spill was in the Gulf of Mexico. So that's another major story, right? Now let's take a look at something. I wanted to know, how do our tabloid fantasies that we call news stack up against historical stories? You can find out, you can quantify this by going to the Vanderbilt Television Archives. They have basically cataloged every primetime newscast on NBC, CBS, PBS, ABC, CNN, and you can go all the way back to the days of Walter Cronkite and find out how many stories occurred in primetime news broadcasts on a particular subject. So let's take a look at what the Vanderbilt Television Archives has to say. On our psychodramas, Elizabeth Smart was on prime time 171 times. Jon Benet Ramsey, 257 times, all the way back to 1996, up until now, 2016. That's 771 primetime broadcasts, and not about black children who were abducted, okay, but about these particular situations that are titillating, entertaining, fascinating, and now let's take a look at our historic stories that don't have that element. Indonesia's tsunami got 18 entries into prime time. Fukushima 135. The Higgs boson, believe it or not, the greatest discovery in science, only made Brian Williams and Wolf Blitzer a total of 9 times. The BP oil spill got 173 entries. That's 335 entries. Now let's graph this. This is where you see what we're talking about in this talk. If you look at psychodramas on the news in prime time versus historic stories, I wanted to know how much time are Americans living in their dream world? What percentage of the time are they preoccupied with their fantasies and their soap operas and their psychodramas versus looking at reality? And the answer, at least with this set of data, is about 70% of the time. Okay? According to one journalist, John Avlon, the news is increasingly artificial in urgency, fiction parading as fact, and it is making us stupid. Charlie Sheen and the Kardashians were mentioned more on television and in newspapers than the war in Iraq. It is a sign of society amusing itself to death. So we are living in a world that is far more skewed and distorted and strange and bizarre than we realize. We are gradually, as a people, losing contact with reality as we swim in this confusion between our fantasies and our psychodramas and reality that surrounds us. So if you look at tabloid journalism, propaganda, and consciousness, like the National Geographic did, this is where it gets really kind of scary. The National Geographic did a study, not of second graders, but of adults 18 to 24, on how much they know about geography. Okay? 63% of this population could not find Iraq on a map. 50% couldn't find Ohio. 51% could not find Japan. 75% did not know that Muslims are the majority religion in Indonesia. 54% did not know that the Sudan is in Africa. 30,000 people died of starvation in the Sudan recently. And half of the American population doesn't even know where that place is. Can't even identify the continent. Now, this extends beyond geography. The National Geographic was arguing for better teaching of geography in our schools. But the level of stupidity transcends geography. This is another sample of young adults, 18 to 24. 70% did not know that Roe versus Wade was the Supreme Court ruling on abortion. 80% did not know that the Senate was made up of 100 senators. 30% still believe that Alan Greenspan was the head of the Federal Reserve, although he retired over a decade ago. 60% did not know that the Amazon went through South America. Remember that propaganda basically means that you're lying in the widest sense of the term. You're being lied to. So when we think about propaganda, we're actually asking this question. If I was an executive producer of a news show, I would ask you, I was interviewing, and I would say, well, would you like to hear stories about bad things that people have done to you? And you'd say, yeah, that to me would be news. Bad things that people have done to me. Why? Because that makes me feel victimized, makes me feel righteous, stirs up anger, indignation, gets me all riled up, hot under the collar. Yeah, tell me those kinds of stories. Well, what about stories where you do bad things to other people? How do you feel about us telling you bad things that you do to other people? No, I'm not interested in that. Because why do you want to rub my nose in it? Okay, I'm not interested in watching a show where you shame me, rub my nose in, make me feel bad, make me feel bad about my country. So, no thank you. I'm going to turn off your show. I'm not interested in watching that kind of stuff. So, you may have conspiracy theories about what propaganda is or the Illuminati behind it, but as a psychologist, there are certain psychological processes that are governing a lot of the propaganda we're now talking about. This first story, we're now going to look at blind spots, things that we don't know anything about. okay? Things that we have blocked either because of denial or because we just don't want to hear about them. So let's take a look now at 3 blind spots. The first one is a story of Lockerbie versus Flight 655. If you think about your thing in your head, you say, well, I think I've heard of Lockerbie, but I have certainly never heard of Flight 655. Well, what is Lockerbie? Lockerbie begins in 1988. Muammar Gaddafi threw a bomb in an American dance hall in Berlin, killing 2 soldiers. Ronald Reagan didn't like it, sent the Air Force to Libya and killed 100 people, including Gaddafi's 18-month-old baby. He didn't like that, and so he had 2 of his agents put a suitcase bomb on a flight from Frankfurt to Detroit, killing about 270 people, so many on the ground. It crashed in Lockerbie, Scotland. Here's a little bit about that story, which I assume you've heard about in some, even though it's long distant past.
December 21st, 1988. In a few short, violent moments, 270 people died. 11 of the victims were killed on the ground in Lockerbie when debris from Pan Am 103 rained down on their streets and homes. The aircraft, luggage and bodies were scattered over a wide area. People from 21 countries filled these coffins. 189 of them were American. The investigation that started at this massive crime scene led investigators to 2 suspects, Libyan men, Abdel Basset Ali al-Megrahi and Al-Amin Khalifa Fima. Libya refused to hand them over until 1999. A year later, their trial began at a special Scottish court sitting in the Netherlands. They were accused of being Libyan intelligence agents and planting a bomb in a suitcase on the doomed flight. After the Lockerbie trial, relations between Libya's President Gaddafi and the world began to warm. Libya paid compensation to the families of Lockerbie victims and accepted responsibility for the bombing. It abandoned its nuclear weapons program. Libya was considered open for international trade and diplomacy.
So that gives you a little brief review of the Lockerbie issue.
From 2 people who lost loved ones on the Pan Am Flight 103 bombing. Rabbi Stephanie Bernstein's husband was killed. Michael Bernstein, Brian Flynn lost his brother.
So it wasn't over in 1988. The story continues. It still makes prime time news, and there are some pictures of the where the airliner crashed into this Scottish village, and there are monuments in the United States for all of the Lockerbie victims. So it is memorialized, it is celebrated, it is remembered. Okay, so that's the story of Lockerbie, and I think most of you have heard of it. Let's now go to, because that's a story about bad things that people did to us. Now let's talk about bad things that we did to other people, which is a story we don't want to hear about. This is called Iranian Flight 655. We shot out an Iranian airliner out of the sky. It was filled with civilians. They were families and children who were on their way from Iran to the religious centers in Saudi Arabia. It had wandered over an aircraft carrier, and we blew it out of the sky and killed 290 people, 60 of whom were children.
The U.S. government deeply regrets this incident.
By July 1988, the Straits of Hormuz in the Persian Gulf had become a shooting gallery for shipping caught up in the war between Iran and Iraq. The United States moved in strength to protect the international waterway.
We were there to protect U.S. national interests. We escorted tanker convoys in and out of the Gulf. There was no question about it, no hesitancy on our part to do that, to fulfill the mission.
Early in the morning of the 3rd of July 1988, the USS Vincennes moved into the Persian Gulf. It was the most advanced missile cruiser in the US Navy.
The idea of putting the Vincennes in the Gulf was not something that everyone in the Navy was comfortable with. It's a very crowded environment. So it's just crisscrossed with air traffic corridors. There are very few places you can go where you're not in one or near one in the Persian Gulf. And that was not the optimal situation for that kind of ship.
The Vincennes had only been in the Gulf for a few weeks. In that short time, it had already acquired something of a reputation.
One of the lieutenants on the Nicholas told me that they didn't think highly of the Vincennes and that the ship was considered trigger happy.
The captain of the Vincennes, Will Rogers, was seen as a man hungry for action and on the fast track to the coveted rank of admiral.
We remain alert and we'll stay alert, but at the same time I don't want to ever give the impression that we're leaning forward on our toes to get a major conflagration started here. That's not the case at all.
So the aircraft flew over, was shot out of the sky, and it was reacted to by Iranians with horror. It was an act of terrorism. 10,000 people demonstrated in the streets of Tehran, coffins, grieving widows, all sorts of stories on Iranian television about American terrorists who killed innocent children and men and women and families. But we didn't really cover that story much at all on our media. Captain Rogers, actually, under George Bush, by the way, no one was demoted and no one was prosecuted and no one was fired for this act. Captain Rogers was given the Legion of Merit a few years later and for outstanding service. But Iranians didn't like the idea. They sent some agents to San Diego and found his wife's SUV and set his wife's SUV on fire, because obviously there was a considerable amount of Iranian anguish and anger about this incident. So I want to bring up some commonalities, and then we'll talk about differences. The commonalities, both of these stories, Lockerbie and Flight 655, happened in 1988. Both killed innocent civilians. Both killed children, 6 in Lockerbie, 66 on Flight 655. Both were perceived by their respective populations as acts of terrorism and injustice. Okay? Now, if you graph the number of deaths from 655, it's greater than Lockerbie. Okay? 290 versus 270. Now, if you graph the amount of compensation that was paid, we demanded $2.7 billion from Gaddafi to be paid to the families that were killed on Lockerbie, and he paid it. We paid. We admitted guilt quietly, not covered by the media. We admitted guilt and paid $61 million to the victims of Iranian Flight 655. Now, here is where the action is. If you go to the Vanderbilt Television Archives and look at their database and say how many stories happened on this subject and how many stories on the other, this is where the blind spot becomes quite evident. The total number of primetime stories about Lockerbie and Wolf Blitzer interviewing the victims of that crash, 333. The total number of stories since 1988 that made prime time, okay, 2. There are 150 times more coverage of Lockerbie, what they did to us, than Flight 65, what we did to them. Now, you can have a conspiracy theory about this if you want, but as a psychologist, I think that one of the roots of propaganda is as simple as that. Tell me stories about things that make me angry. Don't tell me stories about things that make me ashamed. And if I'm the executive producer and I'm trying to sell you a Toyota, well, then I'm going to give you the kind of stories that I think you're going to want to see. That doesn't mean we are portraying reality in any way, shape, or form. These are the sponsors. These are the people who want eyeballs, who want market share, who want an audience, who are willing to pay for that news broadcast if it attracts more than a couple million people in the evening. So the kind of stories that are told on that newscast have to be compelling. And stories about Flight 65 are not compelling. They're not going to turn anybody on. They're going to turn people off. So they don't get reported, and therefore we don't know about them. By the way, this is a quote from a Washington journalist. Americans might not know about Flight 655, but Iranians surely do. They can hardly forget about it. We're going to our next blind spot. This is different. It's another area that we know almost nothing about. Israel's nuclear arsenal. So here's a little bit of a film clip that brings this to light. It's not coming from the mainstream media, I can tell you that. So this worker at the Dimona nuclear factory tells the world, and he was actually out of the country, and the Mossad came and captured him, kidnapped him, brought him back and put him in prison for 18 years, 10 of which were in solitary. He was a whistleblower, that's all. And he was charged, however, with treason and espionage. He said, "I'm neither a traitor nor a spy. I only wanted the world to know what was happening." Daniel Ellsberg of the Pentagon Papers fame said, Vanunu is the preeminent hero of the nuclear age. So Vanunu was released from prison after all this time, and then he started talking again. And they said, "Okay, you're going right back to prison." And now the conditions of his release are, if you want to be out of prison, you can't have a cell phone, you can't have internet, you can't be on chat rooms, you cannot come close to embassies, you cannot come close to the border, you cannot leave Israel, you cannot visit any port of entry. And now you can be free. And this is currently. So Israel is still sensitive about this. So the question is it true, or is he just an anti-Semitic liar? Well, Ron Rosenbaum wrote a book, very good piece of scholarship, called How the End Begins. And he talks about where World War III is most likely to occur. India and Pakistan is certainly one area, but the Middle East is certainly the other. And our ignorance of this area is part and parcel one of the reasons that it might be ignited. Now, he said that Israel had about 225 nuclear weapons, perhaps as many as 400, mounted on Jericho missiles, on aircraft, and on submarines. Now, that's corroborated by the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, which alleges Israel has 80 nuclear weapons, 50 deployed on Jericho missiles, and others on aircraft and submarines. So there are differing numbers, but 80, 225, some say 400. But very few say none. So there's the Jericho missile, there's the Dimona nuclear facility, but the most interesting thing is that Israel has purchased submarines from Germany that house what are called submarine-launched cruise missiles. So it has mastered the technology of miniaturizing nuclear weapons. It has placed them on cruise missiles and has put them on submarines directly off the coast of Iran. within 15 miles of the shores of Iran, Israeli nuclear submarines have primed nuclear missiles pointing at them 24 hours a day. So this is our blind spot. We never talk about this subject. But let's take a look at all of the questions that have never been talked about by any president, any Secretary of State, any Department of Defense official. Does Israel have nuclear weapons or not? Yes or no? Does it have a hydrogen bomb? Does it have a neutron bomb? How many centrifuges does Israel have? We hear about Iranian centrifuges all the time. How many does Israel have operating? How many nuclear weapons does it really have? Now, if you remember France, I mean, Israel has about an arsenal that some say is as big as France. France has about 300 weapons, but they blew up 200 weapons to develop their nuclear arsenal. So let's think about it. If Israel has 200 nuclear weapons, they had to have at least 100 nuclear explosions to develop their arsenal. Where did they test their nuclear material? Where did they blow up 100 nuclear weapons? Their country is 290 miles long and 85 miles wide. If they did it in the Negev Desert, then the Negev Desert has pock marks of 100 radioactive pock marks throughout the desert. Did they test their weapons on American soil? Where did Israel test its weapons? So, there are a lot of questions to ask on this subject, and we have to realize there is a total news blackout in the United States. Tom Brokaw interviewed Ronald Reagan, never brought the subject up. Matt Lauer interviewed George Bush, never got around to that issue. Thomas Friedman of the New York Times has written about Israeli nuclear weapons, never mentioned it to Barack. Wolf Blitzer is always talking about something related to nuclear war, but never about this subject. Jon Stewart, who many people respect as a person who's not going to be influenced by taboos, never brought it up with Clinton, and he does not like Donald Rumsfeld, and he still never brought it up with Donald Rumsfeld. The distinguished Charlie Rose interviewed Barack Obama and never raised the question. And it just seems to go right over our head that nobody talks about the elephant in the room. But, by the way, Matt Lauer makes $20 million a year. Diane Sawyer, $12 million. Charlie Rose, $8 million. Wolf Blitzer, $5 million. This is the corporate media, and this is what they don't tell us, and the questions they don't ask. But there was one woman, brave, intrepid journalist, who her name was Helen Thomas. She was in the White House press room for 57 years. She started under Eisenhower. She went through 11 administrations, and she had the courage to ask the forbidden question. She asked Barack Obama a very well-worded question. She said, "Mr. President, do you know anyone in the Middle East that has nuclear weapons?" Very simple question. Never before asked of any president. What do you think Barack said? Did he lie to the American people, who have been friends of Israel for more than a generation? What do you think he said? Did he finally come clean? He said, "With respect to nuclear weapons, I don't want to speculate." That's it. Okay, so let's go back to looking at our blind spot here, because this is the blind spot. Israeli nuclear subs are off the coast of Iran as we speak. The Leviathan, the Dolphin, the Takuma, they are on 24-hour patrol. The missiles have a range of 1,000 miles. They can hit Iran in minutes. They carry up to 16 nuclear warheads. Each one of them is about 3 times the size of Hiroshima. Iran has absolutely no defense against this. That little red spot is our blind spot. This subject is never, ever talked about on the media, on Face the Nation, in press conferences, on Meet the Press, anywhere. Not Jon Stewart, no one. Okay? Iran is under the threat of nuclear annihilation 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They have nothing that could stop those missiles. Okay?
Meant to ensure a permanent naval presence near the Iranian coastline.
So there it is. Now, if you, instead, we're constantly obsessed with the idea that Iran is going to start a nuclear war. And if Iran gets a nuclear weapon, they were going to develop hegemony in the region. We're obsessed with Iran's nuclear facilities. Is it time to start another war? Netanyahu comes in front of the United Nations and warns the world of the great danger that is facing us. The Iran nuclear deal is considered weak. Cruz stands up and says we cannot support it. We're on our way. You're next, Iran, if you continue this aggressive belligerence. Okay? That is what we see virtually every day about the Iranian situation. Now, there was another blind spot. It wasn't that blind, but if you remember, the Soviets put nuclear missiles in Cuba that could hit Washington and New York in minutes, and it was not something that Washington approved of and said, oh, well, never mind, we can live with that. No. World War III almost began after that incident. Now, what we have here is coverage of one part of this story and almost no coverage on the other side. So let's go back to the Vanderbilt Television Archives and look at the coverage of our media. These are stories that made primetime news about a phrase called Iran nuclear weapon. You search under that phrase in their database and you will come up with 57 stories that made primetime news. If you search under the phrase Israel nuclear bomb, you get 3 stories, okay? 3 stories dating back to 1969. Okay, there was one in which in 1969 Egypt said Israel doesn't have a bomb. That made national news. I think that happened in the time of Walter Cronkite. The next story is in 1980, there was a rumor that Israel detonated a nuclear device in South Africa. Well, maybe that's where they tested their weapons. This is a single incident, however. But the following day, there was another story that said, no, Israel did not test any nuclear device in South Africa. That's back to 1980. There's nothing since under those search terms. Okay? So this here is our blind spot. There it is crossing the screen. It is right off the coast of Iran. It is pointing 16 nuclear missiles tipped with nuclear warheads ready to strike any place in Iran at a moment's notice. In minutes it can be in Tehran. No defense against them. Constant every single day. No one ever talks about that reality. Now, we have lots of blind spots, and I was thinking, what would be another blind spot to talk about? Is 2016. This is an election year. So let's talk about the blind spot that's coming up, that's facing us all. And you say, Kroth, you're a psychologist. We have had enough talk about these candidates. We are saturated. We are tired of hearing about it. There is no blind spot here. We've heard it all. We know about Trump. We know all about their campaign rhetoric. No blind spot. We are saturated with this information. So this is one place you and your psychological theories can go elsewhere. So we're saying, eeny, meeny, miny, mo, who are we going to get to run the show? And there's no blind spot to hear in the minds of most people. But I'm a psychologist, right? So get ready. Freud said, if you're living in a dream world, a dream is made up of 2 parts, the part that you see and the hidden part that you don't see. Carl Jung said something similar. He said, if you're having a dream, sometimes the shadow, the opposite of the dream, is what is true. So if we're saying eeny, meeny, miny, mo, who are we going to get to run the show? That gives us a sense of empowerment. It's up to us to decide. We're choosing our next leader. It's American democracy in action. We are empowered to do these things. If it's not us, it's nobody. Well, what's the shadow? Well, the shadow is the opposite. You're not empowered at all. Your vote means nothing. Your points of view mean nothing. You're helpless and powerless. That's the shadow. Well, I don't know if I can make this point, but I'm certainly going to try. So let's begin. I know you're a bit cynical, so give me a moment of your time. Okay? There's the average net worth of the average American family. Now, if you take assets, my house and the value of the house, and liabilities, how much I still owe on the house, my pension, my credit card debt, my savings, my student loan debt, and add it all up and subtract it, what you come up with is $90,000. That's the average net worth of the average American family. Might be a little disappointing to you, but that's statistically where we are. Okay? Now, let's take a look at the average congressman, okay? The average congressman is worth, her net worth is $7.8 million. It is 86 times greater than the families that congressman represents. Your congressman is likely to be 86 times wealthier than you are. Okay? All right, so that might be a bit of a surprise. Let's take a look at the Senate and see where they stand. The average senator is worth $14.2 million net worth. Some are poorer, some are richer. The average is 4.2. He or she is 157 times wealthier than the average family that elected that senator to office. Now, here's a bit of an issue, okay? If you ask, well, how much do you have to be, how wealthy do you have to be in the top 1%? Well, the entry level to get into the top 1% is $14 million. So the average senator is in the top 1%. Now we have to think about this. According to the Constitution, it says a bill must pass both houses of Congress by a majority, and then once it does that, it's signed by the president, and then it becomes law. If the Senate does not approve, it doesn't become law. Okay, now follow my logic. Get ready. I'm going to get things a little messed up in your head now. If the average senator is in the top 1%, and nothing can become law without the approval of the Senate, then nothing can become law without the approval of the top 1%. You following? Well, that's called a plutocracy. A plutocracy is the government by the wealthy. A democracy is a government by the majority. So we're in effect governed by the top 1%, whether we like to admit it or not. But things get a little dicier when we talk about the election. There's Carly Fiorina. My golly, she's wearing blue jeans. She's got a cinched up blouse. She looks like Annie Oakley out there in Iowa. Why, she's standing in front of a cow. Why, I think she's got dirt under her fingernails just like all the rest of us. I think she's one of us. I don't know where I'm coming up with this accent. They don't speak like that in Iowa. But the idea is that she's giving the impression with the propaganda that she's one of you, one of us, one of those real people with dirt under their fingernails who knows how to pluck a chicken and milk a cow. Okay, I might vote for her because she has empathy. She's one of us. Well, here comes the other side of that. Carly Fiorina is one of the wealthiest women in the United States. She is worth $51 million net worth. She is 566 times wealthier than the average American family and about 6 times wealthier than the average senator. Okay? If she was talking to an audience of 500 people, she could afford to buy up all of their farms, all of their mortgages, all of their student loan debt, and have plenty left over for herself and her family. Carly Fiorina is a mogul. She's in the top 1%. Okay? She has a wonderful house, and there are no cows anywhere near her estate. That's Carly Fiorina. That's who we're really talking about here, who's running for president. Now, Hillary Clinton gets down with, after all, she is a Democrat. She is for the people. She's for organized labor. She is cozy with the United Auto Workers and the nurses union and the police union and the firefighters. And she doesn't mind eating junk food at all. She's one of us. She's out there slumming with the rest of the average American and portraying herself as one of those people. But if you look at her net worth, it's $45 million. In fact, one person said Hillary Clinton is not in the top 1%. Hillary Clinton and her husband are in the top 1/10 of 1% of American income inequality. Hillary has some very gorgeous homes, and you have to ask, has the president of the United Auto Workers ever been invited to dinner there? Okay. So this continues. Jeb Bush is worth $22 million. He has 244 times the wealth of the average American family. So Forbes did an analysis of all 21 people running for president, okay? And they excluded Trump because he's too rich. But the net worth of the average person running for the president of the United States puts them virtually in the top 1%. In other words, the 1% governs us in the Senate, and the 1% is going to govern us in the presidency. Okay? Now, there are some poor senators, who, like poor Lindsey Graham, he just dropped out. He's only worth $1.5 million. And Marco Rubio is worth less than $1 million. But they have sugar daddies. Paul Singer is worth $2 billion. Who was the underwriting some checks there for the for the campaign of Lindsey. Sheldon Adelson is worth $26 billion. He's the sugar daddy for Marco Rubio. So the New York Times said there are 158 families which are paying 50% of all presidential campaign expenses. So the publicists, the buses, the clothes, the scheduling, the campaign manager, the ads, the TV ads for both parties, all 21 candidates, half of their budget comes from just 158 American families. And these are what some of their houses look like. Now, you take a look at those houses and ask, are those houses in my neighborhood? Have you ever seen a house like that in your neighborhood? Okay. So, eeny, meeny, miny, mo changes to eeny, meeny, miny, mo, which of the American oligarchy, the elite, the top 1%, will we choose to basically ignore us after they win the presidency? George Carlin said it in a slightly more vulgar way, but I think there's a lot of truth to this comedian.
But there's a reason. There's a reason. There's a reason for this. There's a reason education sucks, and it's the same reason that it will never, ever, ever be fixed. It's never going to get any better. Don't look for it. Be happy with what you got. Because the owners of this country don't want that. I'm talking about the real owners now. The big, the wealthy, the real owners, the big wealthy business interests that control things and make all the important decisions. Forget the politicians. They're irrelevant. The politicians are put there to give you the idea that you have freedom of choice. You don't. You have no choice. You have owners. They own you. They own everything. They own all the important land. They own and control the corporations. They've long since bought and paid for the Senate, the Congress, the state houses, the city halls. They got the judges in their back pockets. And they own all the media companies, so they control just about all of the news and information you get to hear. They got you by the balls. They spend billions of dollars every year lobbying to get what they want. Well, we know what they want. They want more for themselves and less for everybody else. But I'll tell you what they don't want. They don't want a population of citizens capable of critical thinking. They don't want well-informed, well-educated people capable of critical thinking. They're not interested in that. That doesn't help them. That's against their interest. That's right. You know something? They don't want people who are smart enough to sit around the kitchen table to figure out how badly they're getting fucked by a system that threw them overboard 30 fucking years ago. They don't want that. You know what they want? They want obedient workers. Obedient workers. People who are just smart enough to run the machines and do the paperwork and just dumb enough to passively accept all these increasingly shittier jobs with the lower pay, the longer hours, the reduced benefits, the end of overtime, and the vanishing pension that disappears the minute you go to collect it. And now they're coming for your Social Security money. They want your fucking retirement money. They want it back so they can give it to their criminal friends on Wall Street. And you know something? They'll get it. They'll get it all from you sooner or later because they own this fucking place. It's a big club, and you ain't in it. You and I are not in the big club. By the way, it's the same big club they use to beat you over the head with all day long when they tell you what to believe. All day long, beating you over the head in their media, telling you what to believe, what to think, and what to buy. The table is tilted, folks. The game is rigged. And nobody seems to notice. Nobody seems to care. Good, honest, hard-working people, white collar, blue collar, doesn't matter what color shirt you have on. Good, honest, hard-working people continue. These are people of modest means. Continue to elect these rich cocksuckers who don't give a fuck about them. They don't give a fuck about you. They don't give a fuck about you. They don't care about you at all. At all. At all. Yeah. You know?
Now, you might say, well, that's comedic hyperbole, but I just don't think it's that true. Well, it's truer than you might imagine. Larry Bartels from Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs did a long regression equation in which he dissected American income levels and looked at how much American public policy reflects income levels, and that was astonishing. Americans at the 50th income percentile are barely more likely to see their policy preferences reflected in actual policy than those at the 10th percentile. It is only when you get to the 90th percentile, we're talking about the 90th percentile is a pretty high level in terms of net worth and income. When you get to the 90th percentile, then some policy preferences get reflected in national policy. But below that, you're ignored, really effectively ignored. Giuseppe Prezzolini said, representative government is artifice, a political myth designed to conceal from the masses the dominance of a self-selected, self-perpetuating, and self-serving traditional ruling class. And that is where our 21 candidates for the presidential election come from. So, here's the summary of the propaganda machine from today's talk. 1. First blind spot. The 7th worst aviation disaster in the history of the world we know nothing about because we caused it. We killed 290 people. Iranians have not forgotten it. To them, it was an act of terrorism. And if you look at it objectively, it is the second worst act of terrorism in the air. It is the second worst bombing of a civilian airliner. Now, we don't think of it as an act of terrorism. We think of it as an accident, as a mistake. But from the Iranian perspective, it is the second worst act of international terrorism in the skies. But the point of this talk is we don't know about that story. The second story we don't know about is that there are nuclear missiles in Israel, nuclear weapons in Israel, nuclear missiles on submarines that are 12 miles to 15 miles off the coast of Iran every single day, 365 days a year, pointed at Iran. And there's a story right there that just came out a couple weeks ago of the 6th submarine that Israel bought for $2 billion from Germany. It's a long article published by United Press International. There is absolutely no mention of the fact that the purpose of that submarine is to carry nuclear weapons and to launch submarine launch cruise missiles. 70% of that story is censored, and we don't even notice it. And our third blind spot is that we are far less in control of our destiny in the 2016 election than we are told that we are. So in the meantime, instead, more distraction and denial, more psychodrama, more hypnosis, more Nancy Grace, more Geraldo, more sex slaves, more titillation, more anesthesia to keep us living inside the dream instead of becoming conscious of the reality of our lives. Thank you very much for watching.
Okay, what? Does he have a penis?
Well, that's the part everybody wants to ask, but everybody's afraid to ask, right?
I really don't have another way. I was grasping for words. I didn't know quite how to put it out there. That's a video from East Keeping Up with the Kardashians.
The best answer I've got is that she has said in the past that'll be the last part. If she ever decides to go there, that'll be the last part that happens. We've got no reason to think it's happened yet. But we see the new face. The facial reconstruction surgery went so well. We see it on the cover of Vanity Fair with Caitlyn Jenner there. Additionally, we see quite an impressive chest that was not there a few months ago. So you can see there has been a dramatic change, and that's why she was posing for these pictures.